There are moments in a man's life that define him not by the choices he makes deliberately, but by the choices he makes in silence. Not by the grand gestures that others will remember, but by the small decisions made when no one is watching, when the cost of doing the right thing is visible and the reward is uncertain. These moments don't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, sometimes disguised as an ordinary day, and a man only knows afterward that his life split into a before and an after. The man who walks away is not the same man who walked toward it. His hands carry the weight of what he chose, whether he laid down the burden or picked it up. The frontier was full of such moments. The history books rarely mention them, but the people who lived through them never forgot. Caleb Mercer was a fence rider. That was all he had ever needed to be. Born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1843, he had come west in 1869 with a wife named Sarah and the kind of hope that dies hard in the plains. They had settled in a cabin 4 miles east of the settlement that would become known as Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory. Sarah had planted corn and beans. She had wanted children. She had died of a fever in the summer of 1875, and Caleb had buried her in a grave beneath a cottonwood that still stands. 3 years after that, in the spring of 1878, he was working fence for the Garfield Cattle Company, riding the eastern boundary where the Arizona Territory opened up into canyon country. He was lean in the way that comes from work and heartbreak. His face was sun-darkened, his eyes were gray and set deep, and he had not shaved in several days. He wore a dusty brown wide-brimmed hat, a faded blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a brown leather vest worn soft with use, dark trousers, and boots scuffed from the saddle and the stirrup. His hands were calloused from rope and wire and wood. His posture was straight, but never hurried. He was the kind of man who did not seem to age because he had already lost what aging takes away. The canyon system he rode was a maze of dry washes and stone walls that turned the heat into something visible. By midday in spring, the air above the canyon floor wavered like water. Caleb knew the system well. He knew where the shade was deepest at afternoon. He knew which washes filled in the monsoon season and which stayed dry all year. He knew the names of the ridges in English, and he knew some of them in Apache. His horse, a bay named Coleman, knew the ground better than Caleb did. They moved together like men who had been riding the same territory for years. There was no wasted motion between them. The fence line ran for 17 miles along the eastern edge of the company's holdings. 3 times a week, Caleb rode it, checking for breaks in the wire, looking for cattle that had slipped through, watching for signs of rustlers or predators. It was work that suited him. The solitude was not a hardship. He had gotten used to having no one to talk to but the horse. The quiet had become a kind of company. On a Tuesday in late March, with the temperature climbing toward 90 by mid-morning, Caleb was riding the south end of the system when Coleman suddenly stopped. The horse's ears came forward. His nostrils flared. He would not move forward. Caleb knew better than to argue with the horse's senses. He dismounted and led Coleman to a stand of mesquite, secured the reins loosely, and moved forward on foot toward the edge of a dry wash that Caleb had ridden past 100 times without incident. The wash was not deep at that point, maybe 12 feet down. It opened into a wider canyon system beyond. Caleb stepped to the edge and looked down. At first, he saw only the ordinary debris of the wash, scattered rocks worn smooth by water that had not flowed in years, dried wood bleached gray by the sun, the bleached skull of what might have been a pronghorn antelope or a mule deer. Caleb's eyes moved across these things with the ease of familiarity. He had seen this wash 100 times, and it was always the same, a dead place, a place that belonged to stone and heat and nothing else. Then he saw the boy. The child was lying against the far wall of the wash, half turned onto his side, his small body fitting into a depression in the rock as though he had been shaped into it by the force of his own fall. He was small, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, small enough that he looked like something else entirely at first, like a piece of discarded clothing, like refuse. His dark hair was cut short above the shoulders in the Apache way. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings, worn thin with use. Around his neck hung a thin leather cord with a small turquoise stone pendant, the color impossibly bright against the dull landscape. His right leg was bent at an angle that nature had not intended, the bone of his shin exposed at a point just below the knee, visible through a tear in the leggings and the skin. The leg had not been splinted. No one had tried to set it. The boy was conscious. His dark eyes were open and steady and watchful. He was watching Caleb with the kind of attention that suggests a mind working through consequences, calculating whether this arrival meant salvation or further harm. There was no fear on the boy's face, only awareness, only a kind of waiting. Caleb did not think. He had learned long ago that thinking too much about a right choice often led to not making it. He looked back at Coleman. The horse was calm now, waiting. Caleb turned back to the wash. He began to descend the wall, testing each handhold, watching for loose rock. The descent took longer than it should have because he was careful. When he reached the floor of the wash, dust still settling where his boots had disturbed it, he moved toward the boy. The boy watched him approach. He did not move. He did not cry out. He did not flinch. When Caleb was close enough to kneel beside him, the boy spoke a single word in Apache. Caleb did not understand it. He nodded as though he did, then turned his attention to the leg. The bone was badly broken. The boy must have fallen from the ledge above. There were marks in the wash wall where he had struck it on the way down. The injury was at least 6 hours old. Caleb could tell by the swelling and the way the boy's skin had taken on the grayish cast that pain brings when it lasts too long. Caleb needed a splint. He scanned the wash floor and found a branch of mesquite, perhaps 2 inches in diameter and 3 feet long, weathered gray and hard as bone. He cut it to length with his folding knife. From his belt, a good brown leather belt with a brass buckle, the kind that was supposed to last, he removed the belt itself. He would have to work without it for a day or two. The boy watched this preparation with the same steady attention, his dark eyes tracking each movement. Caleb began to fashion a splint, using strips of cloth torn from his own shirt to secure the mesquite branch against the boy's leg. The boy was silent through it all. He did not cry out. He did not writhe. His jaw tightened once or twice, and his hand gripped Caleb's shoulder, but he made no sound. When it was done, Caleb tied the belt around the whole assembly to keep the splint tight. The work took perhaps 10 minutes. When he was finished, he sat back and looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him with an expression that Caleb could not quite read, though he thought it might have been something like respect. Caleb understood what bringing this boy to the settlement meant. The Apache had been pushed off their lands. Tensions were high. There had been raids. There had been retaliation. A man who brought a wounded Apache child to the territorial seat of white authority might find himself famous or infamous, but he would not find himself rich, and he would not find himself welcome. Tom Hadley, who rode for the cattle company, would likely tell him to leave the boy where he was. The general store owner, whose name was Emerson, and whose heart was small and hard, would certainly refuse him supplies. His own position with the cattle company would be questioned. It was possible he would lose his cabin. It was possible his name would become something people spat. Caleb thought about all of this in the space of perhaps 5 seconds. Then he reached down and helped the boy to his feet. The boy bore weight on the splinted leg only slightly. Caleb half carried, half dragged him up the wash wall. Coleman stood where Caleb had left him, apparently unbothered by the addition of a wounded Apache child to the day's work. Caleb fashioned a sling from his saddle blanket and created a kind of carrier that he could rig to Coleman's saddle, keeping the boy's weight distributed and the broken leg from moving. It was the work of another 15 minutes. When it was done, Caleb mounted the horse and reached down to gather the boy up. The child made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a gasp, and then was still. Caleb began the ride back toward his cabin, moving slowly, letting Coleman pick the easiest path through the canyon country. The sun was directly overhead. The heat was a living thing. The carry took 5 hours. 5 hours of careful movement through a landscape that wanted to throw the horse and the rider and the injured child off into the rocks. 5 hours in heat that turned the air above the ground into ribbons of shimmer. Caleb's shirt was soaked through with sweat. His hands were slick against the reins. The boy hung in the makeshift sling, swaying slightly with each step Coleman took, occasionally gripping Caleb's leg for balance. For the first 2 hours, the boy was silent, except for his steady breathing, his dark eyes watching the landscape roll past with a kind of resignation that only children who have survived hard things can manage. Caleb felt the weight of him, not just the physical weight, but the weight of the choice he had made, and he did not regret it. The canyon walls rose around them, throwing shadows that provided brief respite from the sun. In these moments of shadow, Caleb would ease Coleman into a slower pace, letting the horse catch his breath. The boy would rest his head against Caleb's back, and Caleb could feel the quickened heartbeat, the shallow breathing of pain endured in silence. Then, somewhere in the middle of the 4th hour, after they had climbed out of the canyon system and were moving through the more open country that led toward the cabin, Caleb realized they were becoming thirsty. His mouth was dry. His tongue felt swollen. He would need water before they reached the cabin. There was a seep he knew about, a place where water came out of the rock during the dry season, just enough to drink from and fill a canteen. It was perhaps a mile west of their current position. Caleb would not have thought to look for it, would likely have ridden past it without seeing it. But the boy, hanging in the sling and watching the landscape with those steady dark eyes, pointed. The boy's small hand came up, and his finger extended, and he pointed directly toward a ridge formation that meant nothing to Caleb until he remembered. The water was there, hidden in a small gully beneath a particular arrangement of rocks. How the boy knew this, Caleb could not guess. Perhaps he and others of his people had traveled this territory. Perhaps he had been brought here as punishment or punishment practice. Perhaps he simply read the landscape the way other men read books. The important thing was that the boy knew, and he was willing to show Caleb. They rode to the seep. The water was cool and clear, running slowly from between the rocks as though the stone itself was weeping. It was one of the sweetest things Caleb had ever tasted, and he drank deeply, almost desperately, before remembering the boy. He filled his hand with water and brought it to the boy's lips. The boy drank carefully, managing his thirst with a discipline that spoke to hard experience. When they rode on, there was something between them that had not been there before. Not quite friendship. They had no language in common and had just met, had no history beyond a few hours of mutual crisis, but a kind of mutual recognition, a sense that each understood the other to be a thinking being capable of decision, a sense that the other was working to solve the same problem, how to survive the next hour and then the next. It was the basis of respect, and respect was something at least. In the late afternoon, 2 hours before full dark, they reached Caleb's cabin. It was a small structure built of weathered pine and chinked with adobe. A chimney made of stacked stone rose from one end. The porch was just large enough for a man to stand on. Behind the cabin, there was a small corral and a shed for tack and tools. Caleb had built most of it himself in the years since Sarah died. It was a good cabin, comfortable, well made, with no excess and no want. He dismounted carefully and brought the boy inside. He laid him on a cot near the fire. Because there was already a fire going, Caleb kept one burning most days for coffee and for the simple comfort of flame, and set about the work of tending the injury. He had some knowledge of medicine, nothing formal, but the kind that comes from living on the frontier and needing to handle injuries because there was no one else to do it. He had splints from his own healing, herbs from Sarah's stores that were still somehow good after all these years. He cleaned the wound as best he could. He rebandaged it. He gave the boy water and some bread that he had baked the day before. Then he sat by the fire and watched the boy sleep. Word got out by the next morning. Caleb had not told anyone, but the settlement always knew things. People could read the sign, the fresh blood on the bandaging, the way Caleb moved with the careful deliberation of a man keeping a secret. Tom Hadley came riding out around noon, his face set and hard. He was younger than Caleb by about 10 years, lean and quick, with the kind of mind that could calculate profit and loss faster than most men could blink. His eyes could measure the value of a man in the time it took to shake his hand. The cattle company paid him well because he was good at his job and bad at asking questions he was not supposed to ask. But there were limits to his loyalty, and they apparently began and ended at the territorial boundary. "Caleb," Tom said, stepping down from his horse. "You need to bring that boy to the settlement. Let the law handle it." "The boy's leg is broken," Caleb said. "Moving him would set back the healing." "The law will determine what's proper," Tom said. "You keep him here, you'll be marked. Every hand in the territory will know it. The company can't protect you if the settlers decide you're sympathizing with Apache." Caleb said nothing. He did not move from where he was standing, which was in front of the cabin door, effectively blocking entry. "I'm telling you this as a friend," Tom said. His voice was gentler now, which somehow made it worse. "Let it go. Bring the boy in. Let someone else decide what to do with him." "Someone else will decide to kill him," Caleb said. "I'm not going to help with that." Tom looked at him for a long moment. The two men had ridden together for nearly 2 years. They had shared meals and fires and stories. Tom knew that Caleb was not an emotional man, not prone to grand gestures or moral declarations. This made what he was seeing all the more striking. Tom shook his head, remounted his horse, and rode back toward the settlement. He did not come back, but word had spread like wildfire through dry grass. The general store owner, when Caleb rode in 2 days later for supplies, looked at him as though he had announced he was converting to Catholicism and moving to Mexico. The man's wife, a thin woman with a thin smile, refused to sell Caleb anything at all, claiming they were out of stock. It was a lie. Caleb could see the supplies behind the counter: flour, beans, salt. He could see them as clearly as he could see his own hand. He paid his money and rode out without the supplies. The money was not taken. But Mrs. Pruitt, who was a widow and who owned a small house 2 miles from the settlement, brought food to Caleb's cabin. She came at dusk, moving quietly on a horse that did not make much sound, and left her offerings on the porch: smoked meat wrapped in cloth, fresh bread still warm from her oven, vegetables from her garden that she had somehow managed to keep alive through the dry season, tomatoes, peppers, squash, things that had no business growing in the desert, but grew anyway because she willed them to. She never stayed long. She never said much. But the food was always good, always warm, and it sustained Caleb and the boy through the first critical days when the boy's fever spiked and Caleb was certain he would lose him despite everything. 8 days passed. 8 days of cleaning wounds and changing bandages with water heated over the fire. 8 days of giving the boy water and broth, and eventually solid food. 8 days of watching the boy's color improve and the pain in his face diminish, degree by slow degree. 8 days of learning to move around each other in the small space of the cabin without words. On the 3rd day, the boy was able to stand on his good leg, leaning against the cabin wall, looking out through the window at the landscape beyond. Caleb would watch him stand there, the boy's silhouette against the light, and he understood that the boy was thinking about home, about the place he had come from. Caleb did not try to fill the silence. He had learned in his years with Sarah that sometimes the best thing a person could offer was simply space. On the 5th day, the boy asked for something by pointing to a piece of mesquite wood stacked near the fire for burning. Caleb found a knife for him, a small blade with a bone handle, nothing too sharp, nothing that could be used as a weapon against him. The boy accepted the knife with a small nod that might have been acknowledgement or might have been thanks. Then he began to carve. The work was slow, careful, precise. The boy sat by the fire, the mesquite wood in his lap, and his small hands moved with the focus of a craftsman, turning the wood, studying it from different angles, making deliberate cuts. Caleb watched him work, but did not comment. He understood that this was the boy's way of managing time, of creating something when creation was all that was left to him in a situation he could not control. By the 8th day, the boy had created something that looked like it might be a horse, or possibly a dog, or possibly a thing that had no name in English. The proportions were not quite right for any animal that Caleb knew. The legs were too long. The head was angular and strange. And yet, there was something alive in it, something that suggested movement and will. Caleb did not ask what it was. The boy held up his creation with something that looked like pride, turning it so the light caught the wood, and Caleb nodded, and that was all the conversation they needed. The boy wrapped the carved figure carefully in a piece of cloth that Caleb provided, and he held it against his chest as though it were made of spun glass. On the 8th night, Caleb was sitting on his porch after the boy had fallen asleep, when he noticed something wrong with the quality of the silence. The crickets had stopped singing. The night sounds of the desert, the small movements of small creatures, had ceased. Caleb stood and walked out into the yard. To the south, perhaps a mile away, There was smoke rising against the darkness. Not smoke from a fire, but smoke from fires, several fires set in a line, perhaps a signal. Caleb studied the smoke for a long time. Then he went back inside. He moved the boy's cot closer to the fire. He put water and a knife and his rifle within easy reach. Then he sat by the cot and tried to sleep, his mind moving slowly through scenarios, his hands resting on his knees. He did not fear the tribe coming. He had made a choice that he thought was right, and he would stand by it. But he did not know how they would respond to a white man caring for a child of theirs. He did not know if they would see it as good or as further violation. He did not know if they would take the boy and leave, or if they would take the boy and take Caleb as well. He sat through the night, and he did not sleep. In the morning, exhausted and uncertain, he went outside and built up the fire near his porch, where it could be seen from a distance. It was the only gesture of peace he could think of. They came in the morning. Caleb was standing on his porch when he saw the dust cloud on the southern horizon. It rose like a single column, thick and deliberate, and then began to spread as the riders emerged from it. There were perhaps 30 of them, maybe more. Caleb could not count, could not think clearly enough to count. They moved in a loose formation, not quite a charge, not quite a casual ride, something in between. They were mounted on horses that were painted with clay and ochre, making them look like animals that were part of the landscape itself, as though stone and flesh had merged into a single entity. They approached slowly, letting the dust settle around them, making no move toward weapons. As they came closer, Caleb could see the details. The beaded shirts decorated with geometric patterns, the long black hair bound with leather cords, the authority that came from simply moving as though you owned the earth beneath the horse's hooves. They stopped 50 yards away from the cabin, a distance that was neither threatening nor comfortable. The riders fanned out slightly, creating a loose arc, a formation that was both ceremonial and strategic. Then one man dismounted. He was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps in his 50s, with long black hair streaked with gray pulled back from his face. His buckskin shirt was decorated with beadwork that glinted in the morning sun, each bead placed with intention and care. His face was deeply lined, carved by years of sun and decisions and loss. He wore no expression that Caleb could read. He walked toward the cabin with the kind of stride that suggested he had already decided what he would find, had already decided what he would do. When he was perhaps 10 yards away, the boy called out from inside the cabin. It was just one word, a single word in Apache, but it cut through the morning air like a blade through cloth. "Noddy," the boy called. "Grandfather." The Apache man stopped mid-stride. His face changed, barely, imperceptibly to someone who was not looking carefully, but it changed. The corners of his mouth moved. His eyes, which had been hard and carefully controlled, became something else. Something that Caleb recognized as love, though love in a form that Caleb had not seen often, deep and quiet and dangerous. The kind of love that would move mountains or burn them down. The man looked at Caleb, a long look, a measuring look. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the ground where Caleb had built up the fire that morning. Then, without another word, he walked inside. Caleb did not follow him. It was not his place. Through the window, he could see the man kneeling beside the cot. He could see the boy sitting up, reaching for him. The boy's face had changed completely. The watchfulness replaced by something else, something younger and more vulnerable. He could not hear what they said, but the sounds were of reunion, the low tones of Apache mixed with the boy's higher voice, sometimes urgent, sometimes calm. A grandfather with his grandson, a people with their child, returned after being lost. They stayed inside the cabin for perhaps 10 minutes, time that moved strangely for Caleb, stretching and contracting. Then the man emerged, the boy in his arms cradled carefully, the carved mesquite figure held in the boy's small hand. Behind him came one of the other riders, a young man who looked to be perhaps 20, his face marked with ash. The old man spoke in Apache, his voice steady and formal. The young man stepped forward and, with a gesture that was almost ceremonial, began to speak in English. "You carried my grandson through the canyon," the young man translated, the words coming carefully, as though they had been prepared, as though they had been necessary to prepare. "The canyon did not stop you. The territory did not stop you. We will not forget." Then, without another word, the tribal leader turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted with the boy still cradled in his arms, the child's small arms locked around the man's neck. The boy looked back at Caleb once, still holding the carved mesquite figure. His dark eyes met Caleb's, and in that moment there was gratitude and farewell, and a kind of sealing, the kind of moment that marks a person forever. Then they turned, and the man kneed his horse into motion. The other riders moved with him in a fluid motion that suggested long practice. In moments, they had turned the formation, and they were moving back toward the south. The dust rose around them, a golden cloud in the morning light, and they were gone. The smoke that had signaled in the darkness never came again. What happened after was almost anticlimactic by comparison. The cattle company did not fire Caleb, though he expected them to. He suspected this was because word had spread about the water source on the North Ridge, the one the boy had pointed to in the wash, and that water would bring the cattle company more profit than removing one fence rider would. Tom Hadley began to nod when they passed, a gesture that was something like acknowledgement, though not quite apology. Mrs. Pruitt brought food in daylight now, unashamed, and they would sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about the weather and the drought and the state of the territory. The settlers, over time, decided that what Caleb had done was foolish but not evil, a distinction that allowed them to nod to him in the settlement while not quite inviting him to church suppers. Years passed. Caleb eventually expanded his holdings using the water source the boy had found for him. He hired hands. The expanded pasture grew cattle and grew profits. The carved mesquite figure sat on his mantle, a permanent fixture, a thing he looked at when the fire was low and he was thinking about choices made in silence. And every spring, at a time that Caleb came to anticipate, smoke would rise on the southern ridge, not a warning, but a greeting, a confirmation that what had passed between them had mattered and would continue to matter, long after both the man and the boy had turned to dust. In the end, Caleb Mercer's name became one that was spoken in two languages, not famous perhaps in the way that gunfighters or cattle barons became famous, but known, respected. The kind of name that made people pause and reconsider what they thought they knew about the frontier. The kind of name that suggested that when a moment arrived quietly, when a choice presented itself without announcement, a man might find that the right answer was not the easy one, and the easy answer was not the right one, and that a life lived according to that understanding was a life worth living, even if it cost everything, because in the end, it gained something that could not be measured in dollars or territory or anything else the frontier valued. It was measured in the weight of a child in your arms, the steadiness in a boy's eyes that told you he understood you had chosen to help him. It was measured in smoke signals in the spring that said, "We remember. We remember that you helped. We remember that you were a man when it would have been easier to be something less."